somewhere in the continental United States, in a location that may be a national forest or a state park, or simply a patch of remote wilderness accessible by trail, there is a buried container. It was placed there by a man who flew into the nearest city, rented a car with cash, drove to the wilderness in the hours when no one else was on the road, dug a hole in the ground, and placed inside it the tools he would need for the crime he had not yet decided to commit there. He covered the hole. He replaced the vegetation. He marked the location in a way that only he could find, and then he drove back to the airport and flew home to Alaska, where he went back to work and picked up his daughter from school and continued the life that would have been, to every person who knew him in that life, completely indistinguishable from the life of any other capable, self-reliant man in his 30s, building a contracting business in Anchorage. He may have done this 20 times. He may have done it more. The exact number of these buried caches, of these pre-positioned murder kits distributed across the geography of the country in preparation for crimes that had not yet been planned, is something that no one can say with certainty. The man who buried them died in a jail cell in December of 2012 without disclosing all of them, and the FBI investigation that tried to find them was formally closed shortly afterward without answering the question that had defined the entire inquiry, which is, how many people did Israel Keyes kill? The answer is not known. The FBI's best assessment, assembled from what Keyes told investigators across the months of his incarceration, is that the number of his victims was at least 11, possibly more, possibly significantly more, across a timeline that stretched from the late 1990s through the winter of 2012. The 11 was not a confirmed figure. It was the number that Keyes indicated through a combination of deliberate disclosure and strategic withholding, without ever providing the specific information that would have allowed investigators to verify it. He told them enough to confirm that it was real. He told them not enough to allow them to close the cases, identify the victims, or give the families of people who had vanished any kind of answer about what had happened to them. He did this deliberately because in the months between his arrest and his death, he was using the information he possessed as leverage, as the currency with which he negotiated the conditions of his confinement and the degree of access he maintained to his daughter and to the other aspects of his life that he had not entirely abandoned, even from inside a jail cell. The story of Israel Keyes is a story about methodology, about the specific and systematic application of operational discipline to the problem of violent crime in a way that the FBI had not previously encountered in this form, a form that removed almost all of the indicators that criminal investigation depends on, that left investigators who were used to looking for patterns and connections, and victims and perpetrators who knew each other with essentially nothing to work with, because there were no patterns and no connections, and the victims did not know the perpetrator and had been selected not because of who they were, but because of where they happened to be and when. He was born on January 7, 1978, in Richmond, Utah, the third of 10 children in a large, deeply religious family. The family's faith was of a specific and uncompromising kind, a version of Christian identity theology that had been taken to its furthest practical conclusion, a worldview that combined rigid religious conviction with intense anti-government sentiment, and a commitment to self-sufficiency that expressed itself in geographic isolation from the society it regarded as fallen and corrupt. The Keyes family moved from Utah to the rural landscape of eastern Washington state, to the Colville area in the northeastern corner of the state, where the landscape is mountainous and heavily forested, and the population density is low, and the specific combination of space and independence that the family sought was available in ways it was not in more settled places. Growing up in this environment produced in Israel Keyes a specific set of capacities that were, in the ordinary context of the life he was raised for, entirely appropriate and useful. He was physically capable, self-reliant, comfortable in wilderness, skilled with tools and weapons, practiced in the kind of independent practical problem-solving that comes from growing up in a household where the assumption was that you would handle your own problems without recourse to the institutions and systems that others relied on. He was intelligent and attentive, the kind of child who watches and learns and does not always announce what he has absorbed, who understands more than he reveals, and who reveals himself selectively and for specific reasons. The ideology he grew up in left its marks, though the precise nature of those marks and the degree to which they directly shaped his crimes is something that investigators discussed extensively without reaching definitive conclusions. What is clear is that the specific anti-government, anti-social worldview in which he was raised provided a framework in which ordinary social morality held little authority, in which the rules of the larger society were not obligations but obstacles, in which the only legitimate claims on his behavior were those he had chosen to accept rather than those imposed from outside. This framework was not sufficient on its own to explain what he became, since many people raised in similar environments do not become serial killers. But it was part of the specific combination of formation and compulsion that produced him. He enlisted in the United States Army in 1998 at 20 years old and served for 3 years, including a deployment with the 101st Airborne Division. His Army service was, by the accounts available, undistinguished in the negative sense, neither a period of notable excellence nor a period of problems or disciplinary issues. He was, in the Army as in other contexts, the kind of person who managed official assessments with the same careful calibration he applied to everything else, presenting the surface that the institution required and keeping everything else private. He was honorably discharged in 2001 and moved, eventually, to Alaska, where he would establish the life that he maintained as his cover for the years of violence that were, by most investigators' assessments, already underway by the time he arrived. Alaska suited him. The state's specific combination of physical demands and cultural independence, its vast wilderness, and its tradition of self-reliance, and its distance from the lower 48, its particular relationship to official authority, which in Alaska has always been more negotiated and more provisional than in more densely settled parts of the country. All of this was compatible with the person he had shaped himself into. He established a contracting business, became skilled enough at construction to command good work and good pay, and built in Anchorage the kind of functional ordinary life that is the best possible cover for what he was doing when he was not living it. He had a daughter with his girlfriend, and the accounts of his relationship with his daughter from the people who knew him in Anchorage describe something that appears to have been genuine. The one human connection in his life that was not managed and calculated and performed, but was actually felt. He was a good father, by the accounts available. This is not a redemptive detail, and it is not offered as one. It is an operational detail, because the specific quality of his relationship with his daughter is part of what eventually gave FBI interrogators a point of leverage in the months between his arrest and his death. The one thing that could be used against him in the negotiation over what information he would provide, and on what terms. It is also part of the portrait of who he was, the specific combination of genuine human capacity and profound moral vacancy that made him simultaneously a capable father and a man who flew across the country to kill strangers. The bank robberies were the financial infrastructure of his crime career, the mechanism by which he funded the flights, and the rental cars, and the murder kits, and the travel that his system required. He committed 11 confirmed bank robberies, using a method that was consistent and practiced. He disguised himself, selected branches in locations that made quick exits possible, presented a demand note, and left without firing a weapon, avoiding the escalation that turns a bank robbery into the kind of violent crime that generates the most intense law enforcement response. The robberies were carefully calibrated for their specific purpose, which was to produce cash, without producing the kind of evidence that would link them to a larger pattern or to a specific individual. They were professional in the same way that everything he did was professional, not in the sense of being his profession, but in the sense of being executed with the discipline and the planning of someone who had thought carefully about the likely points of failure and had addressed them in advance. The first confirmed violent crime in his record is a sexual assault in Oregon in 1996, when he was 18 years old. The victim was a young woman. He was not arrested for this crime at the time. The details of it are part of the larger picture of his history that investigators assembled after his arrest, when they were trying to understand the full arc of what he had become and when he had become it. And the 1996 assault sits at the beginning of that arc as a confirmed data point about who he was before he developed the specific operational system that would come to define his crimes. The arsons came across the years following the assault, multiple fires in multiple locations, the specific pleasure and destruction of fire that appears in the histories of some violent offenders as an intermediate expression of a compulsion that is building toward something more direct. The arsons were set in various states, in remote locations, with the same attention to avoiding detection that characterized everything else he did. They were not connected to each other by investigators at the time because there was nothing to connect them, no signature, and no evidence trail. Each fire apparently isolated and unexplained. He told investigators, in the sessions after his arrest, that he had escalated from arsons and property crimes to murder in approximately 2001, the same year he left the Army and began moving toward Alaska. The specific progression from arson to sexual violence to murder across a period of years is a trajectory that investigators recognized as consistent with what the research on serial offenders suggests about escalation, the gradual narrowing of the gap between the compulsion and its fullest expression. But the specific timeline Keyes provided about when he first killed cannot be fully verified, because the specific victims he killed during that early period were not identified, and the specific locations of those crimes were not disclosed, and the specific evidence that would confirm or challenge his account is not available because he ensured it would not be. What can be established with confidence begins with the summer of 2011 in Vermont, where the evidence is comprehensive and the account is supported by Keyes's own detailed confession and by the physical evidence that investigation subsequently produced. Bill and Lorraine Currier were a couple in their late 40s who lived in Essex, Vermont, a town in Chittenden County in the northwest of the state, not far from Burlington. Bill worked in the technology sector. Lorraine worked in a nursing home. They had been together for many years and lived an unremarkable and private life in their home, the kind of people whose neighbors knew them and liked them without knowing them particularly well. Ordinary people, in the full and dignified sense of ordinary. People who had built a life that was theirs and that functioned and that gave them what they needed. They had no reason to believe they were in danger. They had no connection to Israel Keyes. They had never heard his name, and he had never heard theirs. They lived in Vermont, and he lived in Alaska, and the gap between those two facts should have been sufficient to ensure that their lives would never intersect. He flew from Alaska in June of 2011. He did not fly to Vermont, because flying directly to the place where he intended to commit a crime was not part of his system. He flew to Chicago, which is where he began renting the car that he would drive eastward across the country toward a victim selection that had not yet been made, toward a crime that was not yet attached to any particular person, toward the specific convergence of preparation and opportunity that he had learned to engineer. He drove from Chicago to Vermont over the course of the drive, covering the distance at night where possible, arriving in Essex with a vehicle that had no connection to Vermont and a person who had no connection to Vermont, and a plan that had been made at the level of method rather than the level of specific target. He entered the courier home in the middle of the night, through the garage, using a technique that the forensic examination of the scene later confirmed. The couriers were asleep. They were taken from their home at gunpoint, their hands secured, and transported in his rental car to a location he had identified in advance, an abandoned farmhouse outside the town. What happened at the farmhouse was documented in Keyes's confession and does not require graphic elaboration to convey its full horror, which is the horror of two people who were in their home sleeping when the night turned into something else entirely, who found themselves in an abandoned farmhouse in the dark, who had no resources and no recourse and no connection to the person who had taken them. Bill Courier was murdered. Lorraine Courier was murdered. Their bodies were left in the farmhouse, which was subsequently demolished before they were found. This last fact is one of the most painful details of the case for the people who knew the Couriers, because it means that their remains were not recovered during the searches that were mounted in the period when they were simply missing and their fate was unknown, that the searches were looking for people who had already been placed beyond finding. The remains were eventually located after Keyes' confession led investigators to the site of the demolished farmhouse. But by then, the location had been significantly disturbed and the recovery was difficult. The Couriers had been missing for months before anyone knew where to look for them. The investigation into the disappearance of Bill and Lorraine Courier was extensive, as investigations into the disappearances of a married couple from a residential neighborhood in a small city always are, and it produced nothing in the way of viable leads because there was nothing to find. There was no motive. There was no prior connection between the Couriers and any identified suspect. The forensic examination of the house produced evidence that someone had been there and had entered through the garage, but produced nothing that identified who that person was. The investigation was serious and sustained, and it could not advance because the investigative tools available to it were designed for a kind of crime that this was not, designed to find connections and patterns and prior relationships and the ordinary machinery by which violent crimes can be traced to their origins, and the Courier case had none of those things. 8 months passed. In the first hours of February 1, 2012, Samantha Koenig was working at a Common Grounds coffee kiosk in Anchorage, Alaska. She was 18 years old, a young woman with an ordinary life in the city where she had grown up, working a late shift at a drive-through coffee stand that sat in a parking lot on the east side of Anchorage, a small, isolated structure that was visible from the road but was not a place where help would come quickly. The surveillance cameras at the kiosk were functioning. The street cameras in the area were functioning. Everything that happened at the kiosk in the early hours of February 1 was recorded. Israel Keyes walked up to the kiosk. He was wearing a disguise. He produced a weapon. He forced Samantha Koenig to leave with him, walked her across the parking lot and out of the camera's direct view, and then she was gone. The surveillance footage captured the beginning of what happened, but not where it went after the parking lot, because after the parking lot, there was nothing to capture, only the dark streets of Anchorage on a winter night, and a man who knew how not to be seen, walking with a young woman who had no idea what was happening to her, or why. He drove to his property, where he had a shed that he had prepared for exactly this kind of use. He killed Samantha Koenig in the shed. He left her there because he had already planned to take a cruise, a vacation that had been arranged before the crime and that he proceeded with, because the management of appearances and the maintenance of the ordinary life required its ordinary activities to continue. He went on the cruise. He returned to Anchorage weeks later. He photographed Samantha Koenig's body, posing it with a copy of a newspaper to make it appear she was alive and holding proof of life evidence, and he sent the photograph to her family with a ransom demand. The photograph was the specific kind of cruelty that the operational analysis of his crimes always returns to. Not the cruelty of impulse or passion, but the cruelty of calculation, of someone who had planned out the next steps and was executing them with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. The family paid what they could raise. The money was not the point. The point was the ATM card. He used Samantha Koenig's ATM card to withdraw money across multiple locations, a decision that was the critical error in his system, the specific deviation from the operational discipline that had protected him across more than a decade of violent crime. He used the card in Alaska. He used it in Arizona. He used it in Texas, moving southward through the country, withdrawing cash at gas stations and convenience stores and the ordinary commercial infrastructure of American life, leaving behind each time he used the card a specific, time-stamped, geographically fixed record of his movement. The FBI investigation that had been initiated around the disappearance of Samantha Koenig, the federal investigation that was running alongside the Anchorage police investigation, had been following the ATM transactions, building a picture of his movement from the ATM records and from the surveillance cameras at the locations where he used the card. By the time he had driven southward through Arizona and into Texas, the investigators had a geographic trajectory and a physical description assembled from multiple camera recordings, a description of a vehicle and a person that the Texas Department of Public Safety could use. On March 13, 2012, a Texas Department of Public Safety officer conducted a traffic stop near Lufkin, Texas. The vehicle matched the description being circulated. The driver, who gave a false name, was Israel Keys. In the vehicle were the items that assembled into a map of what he had been doing: cash, a SIM card, photographs that included images of Samantha Koenig's ATM withdrawals, the operational debris of a crime in progress. He was taken into custody. He was transported to Anchorage, where the investigation into Samantha Koenig's disappearance was centered, and where the FBI would begin the process of trying to understand what, exactly, they had in custody. They quickly understood that they had something they had not previously encountered. The early interrogation sessions with Israel Keys produced a picture that the FBI's lead investigator on the case, Special Agent Jolene Gordon, has described in the specific terms of encountering something that the training and experience she had brought to the interrogation had not fully prepared her for. Keyes was not defensive. He was not evasive in the ordinary way of people who are trying to minimize their exposure or who are calculating how much they can deny. He was controlled, precise, and in a specific sense forthcoming, but the forthrightness was itself calibrated, was itself a performance of a particular kind, was the engagement of someone who had decided to participate in the interrogation on his own terms, and who was managing that participation with the same operational intelligence he had applied to everything else in his criminal career. He confirmed the Koenig murder early in the interrogation process because the physical evidence and the ATM records and the footage from the kiosk made denial non-viable, and he understood this. He confirmed the Courier murders with a specificity that allowed investigators to return to Vermont and to identify the farmhouse site and to begin the process of locating the remains. He provided this information not as a confession extracted by interrogation, but as a disclosure made according to a calculation, an offering of specific information in exchange for specific things, the conditions of his confinement, the ability to maintain some communication with his daughter, the various small privileges that define the quality of life inside a correctional facility. He also disclosed, in the specific way of someone managing the pace of a negotiation, that there were more victims, more locations, more crimes that had been committed across more states, across more years than the Courier and Koenig cases alone represented. He indicated that the number of people he had killed was at least 11. He said this with the same controlled precision he brought to everything else, not as a boast, not in the way of serial killers who sometimes want to be understood as significant in the specific taxonomy of their crimes, but as information, as something he was making available to the interrogators in a quantity and a form that served his purposes. He would not disclose the identities of the other victims. He would not disclose the locations of the other crimes. He would not provide the specific information that would allow investigators to connect the cases he had committed across multiple states to the person now in custody in Anchorage. He held that information with the understanding that it was the last substantial thing of value he possessed, the last leverage, and he was not going to release it without receiving something in return, and the something in return that the investigators could offer was constrained by the reality of what they were negotiating over and who they were negotiating with. The interrogations were extensive. They produced hours of recorded conversation in which Keyes discussed his methods in the abstract, describing how he selected locations and how he planned crimes, and what the operational considerations were that shaped his decisions, providing the specific kind of information that was useful to investigators trying to understand the system without providing the specific information that would have identified the victims and the locations and the families that were still waiting somewhere in the country for answers about people who had disappeared. It described the practice of pre-positioning supplies in remote locations, sometimes years before retrieving them, burying containers with weapons and restraints, and the other materials his crimes required in wilderness areas where they would not be found accidentally, and where he could retrieve them when he had a specific use for them. The discovery of one such cache near Lake Crescent in Olympic National Park in Washington state confirmed that this practice was real and not simply a detail he had invented to make himself seem more formidable, and the discovery of that cache produced in the investigators who found it a specific and verifiable understanding of the scale and the premeditation of what they were dealing with. The cache at Lake Crescent was the kind of object that reveals something fundamental about the person who created it. It was not the product of impulse or anger or any of the familiar human motivations that drive most violent crime. It was the product of planning, of the specific application of forward-looking operational thinking to the problem of how to commit crimes in a way that minimized risk and maximized operational flexibility. Someone had stood in that park and dug that hole and buried that container and marked the location and walked away, knowing they would return when they had a reason to, and the gap between the burying and the returning might be a year or 5 years, or it might never happen at all, and the person doing it was comfortable with that uncertainty in a way that requires a specific kind of psychological composure that most people simply do not have. The specific states in which other caches may exist, the specific locations of the other crimes, the specific names and faces and lives of the people who disappeared and whose disappearances have never been connected to Keyes because he did not provide the connection, are things that the investigation could not establish and that died with him in his cell in December of 2012. He knew, in the last months of his life, that he was the only person who possessed that information, and he made choices about how to manage that possession that left the answers permanently beyond reach. He had expressed, in the interrogation sessions, a specific desire to control the way his story was told and understood. He did not want to be discussed in the media as a conventional serial killer with the specific tabloid framing that he had observed applied to Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy and others whose cases had become famous. He wanted to be understood in terms that he considered more accurate, in terms of the operational system he had developed and the specific sophistication of his methods, and the interrogators managed the conversations with this preference as a factor, using it as part of the negotiation over what he would and would not disclose. They could not fully accommodate his preference without making public representations that were not theirs to make, but they engaged with it as a real element of the dynamic they were managing. The question of what Keyes wanted, of what his ultimate goal was in the period between his arrest and his death, is one that the interrogation transcripts do not fully resolve. He was facing the death penalty for the Koenig murder under federal law. He had already pleaded guilty in principle to that charge and had accepted that he would not be leaving the legal system alive, in the sense of living free again. He was also facing state charges in Vermont for the Courier murders. The combination of these charges meant that his legal situation was, in the most straightforward sense, one without a positive outcome, and the management of information he was engaged in was not the management of someone who believed he could avoid a catastrophic legal outcome, but the management of someone who was trying to define the terms of the only thing left to define, which was how the final chapters of his story would be told, and to what degree he would maintain control of the telling. He was also, in ways that the interrogators found both difficult to manage and important to understand, a person who was genuinely attached to his daughter, who was genuinely distressed by the separation from her that his incarceration produced, and who was using the information he possessed partly as a means of maintaining some connection to her through the period of what he knew was an irrevocable separation. The negotiation over access and communication was real, and was not simply strategic, was not simply a performance of attachment designed to extract concessions. The investigators were dealing with a person who was, simultaneously and without apparent difficulty, the methodical killer of at least 11 people and a father who missed his child. The international dimension of the case is one of its most disturbing unresolved elements. Keyes traveled internationally. He had been to Central America and to other locations outside the United States, and the investigators who worked the case believed that his crimes were not confined to American soil, that the same operational approach he used within the United States, the travel and the geographic separation and the selection of victims with no connection to him, had been applied to crimes in other countries where the investigation had no jurisdiction and no access to the records that might have established what happened. He did not confirm this dimension of the case in the specificity that would have allowed investigators to act on it. He suggested it, indicated it, provided enough to make the possibility real without providing enough to make it verifiable. What investigators were left with across the months between his arrest and his death was the specific frustration of a case in which the answers existed and were withheld, in which the person who could close the open files was choosing not to close them, in which the normal mechanisms of investigation were not available because the normal indicators that those mechanisms rely on were not present. There were families somewhere in the country, possibly in other countries, who had lost people and did not know what had happened to them, and the person who knew what had happened to them was in a jail cell in Anchorage, negotiating the terms of his disclosure with the precision he had always applied to his operational planning. On the morning of December 2, 2012, Israel Keyes was found in his cell at the Anchorage Correctional Complex. He had died during the night from self-inflicted wounds, a combination of lacerations and strangulation. He had also left a handwritten note, a piece of writing that has been described as consisting of a combination of verse and prose, a document whose specific contents have been discussed by investigators without being fully made public, a document that was itself a final piece of the controlled performance he had maintained throughout the post-arrest period, a final management of how the story ended and how the ending would be processed by the people who would find it. He was 34 years old. The FBI investigation into Israel Keyes continued for some time after his death, working with the information he had provided and the forensic evidence that had been assembled across the months of the inquiry, trying to make further progress on the question of the additional victims whose existence he had indicated without specifying. The investigation produced some additional findings, additional confirmations, and additional geographic evidence. But it did not close the fundamental question. It could not, because the fundamental question required the specific information that had died with him. The investigation was formally closed without answering the question of how many people Israel Keyes killed. The number 11 remains the best available estimate, and it is an estimate rather than a confirmed count, because the 11 includes some victims who were identified and some who were not, includes some cases that were confirmed and some that were indicated, includes the full scope of what investigators could establish from what he had told them and what the physical evidence corroborated, and does not include whatever was withheld. The Courier family, the friends and colleagues and neighbors who knew Bill and Lorraine in Essex, Vermont, eventually received the answers that the discovery of the farmhouse site and the recovery of remains provided. The answers were devastating in their specificity, the confirmation of a loss that had already been processed across the months of searching, but they were at least answers, at least the closing of the specific uncertainty that missing persons cases leave behind. The family had waited 8 months from when the couriers vanished to when they had some account of what had happened, and the account they received was the account of strangers who abducted 2 ordinary people from their ordinary home in the middle of a June night, for no reason that was connected to anything about who the couriers were. Samantha Koenig's family received a different kind of accounting, the specific accounting that the evidence trail she left through his use of her ATM card had been the means of capturing the person responsible. There is something in this detail that the investigation has not been able to make comfortable, the knowledge that his one significant operational error was made with Samantha Koenig's card after Samantha Koenig was already dead, that the mechanism of his capture was the mechanism of a crime he had already completed, that her death did not stop him, but the record of what he did with what he took from her did. The families of the couriers and of Samantha Koenig have had to live in the knowledge of what happened in ways that no external accounting can adequately address, have had to find some way to carry the specific nature of these losses forward in lives that did not choose to be defined by them. The 11, or more, who are not identified, are the haunting at the center of the case that the FBI has been unable to close. They are people who disappeared at some point between the late 1990s and 2012, in states across the continental United States, possibly in countries outside it, people whose disappearances were investigated as the disappearances of missing persons are investigated, with the available tools applied to the available evidence, and who could not be found because the person responsible had ensured that the investigation would have nothing to work with. They may have families who reported them missing and who received the standard responses and who have been waiting for decades with the specific agony of a loss that has no explanation, no body, no closure, no answer to the simplest and most unbearable question of what happened. Israel Keyes was a man who had no identifiable victim type, who had no discernible geographic focus, who left no forensic signature that connected his crimes to each other, who funded his crimes through bank robbery to avoid any financial trail, who flew into different cities and rented cars far from his destination, and worked at night, and selected victims who had no connection to him and left nothing behind that would allow the connection to be made from the other direction. He was, by the assessment of the FBI investigators who worked his case, the most operationally sophisticated serial killer they had encountered in the modern era of forensic investigation. A person who had treated the problem of violent crime as a logistical problem and had solved it with a competence that left investigators, even after his arrest, with only a fraction of the picture that the full truth of the case would have contained. He is dead. The picture is not complete. The cases are not closed. Somewhere in the American wilderness, there may be buried containers that have never been found, prepositioned supplies for crimes that were never committed or for crimes whose victims were never identified. Somewhere in the country, There are almost certainly people who were killed by Israel Keys whose families do not know what happened to them and who may never know, because the information that would answer their question was taken out of the world on the night of December 2nd, 2012, in a jail cell in Anchorage, Alaska, by the person who possessed it. The case that Israel Keys left behind is not a case with an ending. It is a case with a termination point, a place where the investigation stopped because the person who could advance it chose to make that impossible, and everything beyond that termination point remains unknown, remains the property of a silence that is complete and deliberate and permanent. The FBI's conclusion was that 11 was the most supportable estimate of the number of victims. The FBI's conclusion was also that this estimate was almost certainly incomplete. 11 is a number. It represents 11 people who had ordinary lives and who encountered Israel Keys at some point and who did not come home afterward. Some of those 11 people are known: Bill Courier, Lorraine Courier, Samantha Koenig. Some of them are not known, are only the suggestion of an absence in some community somewhere, the gap where a person used to be, that was filled in over time by the ordinary way that communities fill the gaps left by people who disappear and are never conclusively accounted for. Those people deserve to have their names in the record. The failure to establish those names is the specific and permanent injury that the Keys case inflicted on the investigation and on the families who are living in its aftermath. The question of how many people Israel Keys killed is the question that defines the case, and that the case cannot answer. It is the question that the investigation was asking from the first moment the scope of his crimes became clear, and it is the question that the investigation was still asking when it was formally closed without resolution. It is the question that will remain open as long as there are people who want to know what happened to someone who vanished during the years when Israel Keys was moving through the country with his rental cars and his buried caches and his operational system that was designed from the beginning to ensure that the question could never be definitively answered. That was the point. The unanswerability of the question was not an accident or a failure of his system, but a feature of it, a deliberate characteristic of the specific approach he had developed to the problem of how to commit crimes without being caught. The recognition that the best protection against investigation is to ensure that the investigation has nothing to investigate, that the connection between the perpetrator and the crime cannot be established because no connection exists to establish. The cases he left behind are not cold cases in the ordinary sense, cases where the evidence exists and has not yet been interpreted correctly. They are cases where the evidence was prevented from existing in the first place, where the system was designed to produce the specific outcome of permanent irresolution. Bill Courier and Lorraine Courier lived in Essex, Vermont, and they were ordinary people who built a life and who did not deserve what happened to them in June of 2011. Samantha Koenig was 18 years old and was working a late shift at a coffee kiosk in Anchorage, Alaska, and she did not deserve what happened to her in the early hours of February 1, 2012. The other 9, or more, who cannot yet be named, wherever they were and whoever they were, did not deserve what happened to them either. They were people. Their lives mattered in the way that all lives matter, regardless of whether a legal system found the person responsible and held him accountable, regardless of whether their names are in the official record of the case or are still in the silence where Israel Keys put them. They are still in the silence. The FBI is no longer actively looking. The families who are waiting for answers may not know they are waiting for answers about this case specifically, may not know that the silence around the disappearance of someone they loved is part of the specific and deliberate silence that a man in Anchorage constructed and then took with him when he died in his cell on a December night in 2012. The buried caches may still be there. The answers may still be there, distributed across the wilderness areas of the American West, in containers that have been waiting for more than a decade for someone to find them, for the specific combination of information and search resources and good fortune that would bring them to the surface. Or the caches may have decayed, may have been disturbed by weather or by wildlife or by the ordinary processes of time that operate on everything buried in the ground without maintenance, may have ceased to contain anything identifiable even if they were found. That is where the case stands. Not resolved, not closed in any meaningful sense, simply stopped at the point where the person who could advance it chose to make advancement impossible and left there, in the specific and particular silence of questions that may never be answered because the only person who could answer them is gone. How many people did Israel Keyes kill? The answer is not known. The answer may never be known. And that, in the end, was what he intended. The specific investigative challenge that Israel Keyes represented has been discussed extensively within the FBI since the case was closed, in training contexts and in academic criminological literature, as a case study in the specific problem of detecting and apprehending a certain type of offender, the type that the existing investigative architecture was not designed to find. The architecture was designed around patterns, around the statistical regularities that most violent offenders produce, geographic proximity to their crimes, prior relationships with victims, escalating contact with law enforcement, the various behavioral signatures that accumulate in the record and that, when analyzed correctly, point toward an individual. Keyes produced none of these things. He produced no geographic pattern, because he was deliberately geographic in his avoidance of pattern. He produced no victim signature because he had no victim type. He produced no escalating law enforcement contact because his interactions with law enforcement were managed with the same discipline he brought to every other aspect of his criminal activity. The investigation into his crimes was initiated not by any of these investigative tools, but by a single operational error that he made in the Koenig case, the decision to use the ATM card. This error produced the specific geographic trail that allowed investigators to build a trajectory and to have that trajectory converge with the traffic stop in Texas. Without the ATM card, the investigation into the disappearance of Samantha Koenig would have proceeded with the same absence of viable leads that the Courier investigation had proceeded with, because the forensic evidence at the Common Grounds kiosk, while confirming that a crime had occurred, did not identify the perpetrator. The disguise he had worn was effective. The vehicle he had driven from the kiosk was not immediately identified. The investigation had the surveillance footage, but not the suspect. The ATM card was the error that the rest of his system was designed to prevent. Every other aspect of the Koenig case reflected the same operational discipline as everything else he had done. The disguise, the isolation of the victim in a location that minimized witnesses, the use of a site he controlled for the subsequent events, the management of the period between the crime and the discovery through the cruise and the return. He had made no forensic errors at the kiosk or at the property. He had managed the timeline with care. The ATM card was the single deviation from a system that had otherwise been constructed to leave investigators with nothing, and that single deviation was enough. The question of what would have happened if he had not made that error is one that the investigators who worked the case have addressed in various ways. They believe, based on what they learned from Keyes about his operational patterns, that he would have continued. The Koenig case was not in any way a culminating event for him, was not a planned finale or an ending he had been building toward. He had told investigators that he had planned to kill one person per year, approximately, as a discipline of restraint that he had imposed on himself to reduce the cumulative risk of detection that more frequent crimes would produce. He had, by his own account, violated this self-imposed limit in the period leading up to his arrest, killing more frequently, and the violation of his own operational discipline was itself a factor in the heightened risk that led to his capture. The 1 per year discipline, if accurate, and the investigators had no strong reason to doubt it, provides a framework for thinking about the timeline of his crimes that the investigation used to estimate the total number of victims. 11 confirmed or indicated victims across approximately 15 years of active killing, roughly from 1997 to 2012, is consistent with a discipline of approximately 1 killing per year, with some years producing no killings and some years producing more. The framework is plausible, but not conclusive, and the investigators working with it understood that it was an approximation built on the account of someone who had strong motivations to manage what he disclosed. The prepositioned caches are the element of the case that most directly confronts the investigator's ordinary ability to think about the timeline and scope of violent crime. A cache buried in the wilderness years before it is retrieved is a statement about how far in advance the person who buried it was thinking about what they were going to do. It represents a planning horizon that most violent offenders simply do not have, a willingness to invest in future crimes in a way that treats those crimes as long-term operational objectives rather than immediate responses to immediate impulses. It is the horizon of an organized crime figure or a military strategist, rather than the horizon typically associated with individual violent offenders, and its presence in Keyes's operational picture is part of what made him so difficult to fit within existing frameworks. The FBI's operational case study on the Keyes investigation, the internal document that attempts to extract investigative lessons from the experience of working the case, has not been fully made public, but elements of its conclusions have been discussed by the investigators who worked the case in interviews and public presentations. The core conclusion, as it has been reported, is that the existing investigative architecture for serial violent crime detection was fundamentally inadequate for detecting an offender of this type, and that the detection of Keyes's crimes required the specific and fortunate convergence of an operational error on his part with the investigative response to that error, rather than the operation of any systematic investigative mechanism that would have found him in the absence of the error. This conclusion is uncomfortable in the specific way that conclusions about systematic inadequacy are always uncomfortable when the inadequacy has human costs attached to it. The people who died in crimes that were never identified, whose families are waiting for answers that the systematic mechanism was not able to produce, are the human cost of the inadequacy. The inadequacy was not the fault of the investigators who worked the case, who applied the available tools with skill and seriousness, and who extracted from a challenging interrogation subject more information than might have been expected, given his sophistication and his motivation to withhold. The inadequacy was structural, was built into the approach to serial violent crime investigation that had been developed around the characteristics of offenders who operated differently than Keyes operated. Special Agent Jolene Godin, who led the investigation from the FBI's Anchorage office, has spoken in public forums about the experience of working the case, about what it was like to sit across from Israel Keyes in the interrogation sessions and to engage with someone who was simultaneously cooperative and withholding, who was providing information at a pace and in a quantity determined entirely by his own calculations, who was treating the interrogation as a negotiation in which he held the more valuable commodity. The experience she describes is one of sustained professional tension, of applying the techniques and the training developed for a different kind of encounter to an encounter that was unlike anything in the training. The interrogations produced hours of recorded conversation that have been partially made available to the public through FBI releases and through journalistic reporting on the case. The recordings show a man who speaks about his crimes in the specific language of someone discussing a professional activity, who uses the vocabulary of operational planning and logistical management, who describes selection and preparation and execution in terms that would be unremarkable in the context of construction project management or military planning, and that are profoundly disturbing in the context of violent crime. The recordings show a man who is, in some fundamental sense, proud of his system, not in a way that he announces or performs, but in the way that competence carries its own quiet satisfaction, the satisfaction of doing something difficult, well, that is legible, even when the something is terrible. The recordings also show a man who is calculating the value of every piece of information he provides, who is monitoring the effect of each disclosure on the investigators across from him, who is adjusting his pace and his level of detail in response to what he observes in the interrogation room. He is performing the interrogation as much as undergoing it, is managing it as much as being managed by it, and the specific sophistication of that performance is part of what makes the recording so disturbing to listen to. The observation of someone operating at a high level of strategic intelligence in a context that requires moral intelligence of a kind he clearly does not possess. He mentioned, across the interrogation sessions, various geographic areas where crimes had been committed. He mentioned Washington State. He mentioned Colorado. He mentioned New York. He provided enough specificity about these references to make them credible as indicators of real crimes without providing enough specificity to allow the crimes to be identified. The investigators worked these references against the records of unsolved violent crimes in the relevant areas and time periods, attempting to find cases that were consistent with what they knew about his methods and his timeline, and they identified cases that were potentially consistent without identifying cases that could be definitively connected to him in the absence of the specific information he had withheld. The Washington State reference has received particular attention because of the discovery of the Lake Crescent cache, which established that he had a confirmed operational presence in Washington, and because there are specific missing persons cases from Washington State in the relevant time period that investigators have examined in the context of the Keyes investigation. The specific cases and the specific analysis have not been fully made public because the investigation did not produce the evidence necessary to officially connect those cases to Keyes, and because the families of the relevant missing persons deserve to be protected from a false connection that could cause additional harm without providing the resolution that a confirmed connection would provide. The international dimension has similarly been examined without producing confirmable conclusions. Keyes traveled internationally, and the specific destinations and dates of his international travel were assembled from the records that the investigation could access. But the translation of those travel records into specific crimes in specific locations required the kind of information that Keyes did not provide, and that the investigation could not develop independently. The concern that his crimes extended beyond U.S. borders is real and has been stated by investigators who worked the case, but the concern has not produced confirmed identifications, and in the absence of confirmed identifications, the families of people who disappeared in other countries have not been informed of a possible connection. The murder kits represent a specific investigative problem that did not end with Keyes' death. The FBI conducted searches in areas that Keyes had indicated contained caches, and the Lake Crescent cache was found, and that find confirmed the practice. But the full number of caches he created, the full distribution of their locations, was not disclosed, and the caches that remain undiscovered continue to exist in whatever wilderness areas he placed them in, degrading over time, possibly found by hikers or by wildlife, without being recognized as what they are, possibly still intact in their original condition, possibly revealing themselves eventually in ways that produce the connection to Keyes's other crimes that the investigation could not establish while he was alive. The possibility of new information emerging from physical evidence, from a cache discovered in a remote area and identified as significant, is real, though not probable in the near term. The possibility of new information emerging from human sources, from someone who knew something about his other crimes and has chosen not to disclose it, or has not known who to tell, is similarly real, though similarly difficult to evaluate. The case is formally closed. The formal closure does not mean that the answers are no longer available to be found, only that the institutional mechanism for finding them is no longer active, no longer processing new information with the resources that an active investigation can bring to bear. The broader question that the Israel Keys case raises for the investigation of violent crime is the question of what is not being detected, of how many offenders operating at a comparable level of operational sophistication are moving through the country without triggering the investigative mechanisms that are designed to find them. Keyes was unique in many respects, and the specific combination of his operational intelligence and his self-imposed constraints and his particular type of pathology is unlikely to be common. But the lessons of his case suggest that the existing investigative architecture has blind spots, has cases of the type he represents that are not being solved because they are not producing the specific kinds of evidence that the architecture is built to find. This is not a comfortable conclusion for the institutions that bear responsibility for detecting and stopping violent crime. It is a conclusion that the investigators who worked the Keys case have articulated in various ways and in various forums since the investigation was closed, and it has produced some institutional response in the form of training and methodology reviews. Whether that response has been adequate to the specific challenge the case identified is something that the outcomes of subsequent investigations will eventually indicate, through the specific pattern of what is and is not being detected and stopped. Bill and Lorraine Currier were in their home sleeping on a June night in Vermont. Samantha Koenig was working a late shift at a coffee kiosk in Anchorage. The others, the 9 or more whose names are not in the public record of the case, were somewhere in the country, or possibly in other countries, doing whatever they were doing on the nights that they encountered Israel Keys, and none of them had any reason to understand that encounter as the specific and final danger that it was. The investigation is closed. The questions are not answered. The silence that Keys created is still there, still holding the specific information that would answer the questions that the families who are waiting need answered, and the silence is permanent because the person who maintained it chose to make it permanent on the night of December 2nd, 2012, in a jail cell in Anchorage, Alaska. How many people did Israel Keys kill? The case is closed. The question is open. To understand the full scope of what the Keys case represents, it is worth spending more time with the specific mechanics of what he did, and why each element of his system was designed to solve a specific investigative problem, because the operational sophistication of his approach is not simply a disturbing characteristic of a disturbing individual, but a genuine contribution to the understanding of what the most dangerous and least detectable form of serial violent crime looks like when it is carried out by someone with both the intelligence to design a system and the discipline to execute it. The geographic separation between his home and his crimes was the foundational principle of the system. He lived in Alaska. He committed the majority of his confirmed crimes in the lower 48 states. The distance between his daily life and his criminal activity was not simply large, but was designed to be large, was a deliberate operational choice that produced the specific investigative problem of a perpetrator with no connection to the jurisdiction where the crime occurred. When investigators look for a suspect in a violent crime, they look first within the victim's social network and within the geographic vicinity of the crime, because the statistical reality of most violent crime is that the perpetrator was known to the victim or was physically proximate to the victim for reasons that can be established. Neither of these statistical realities applied to Keys' crimes. He was not known to his victims, and he was not physically proximate to them except in the specific moments he chose to be. The flight and rental car method solved two investigative problems simultaneously. Flying into a city some distance from his destination meant that anyone tracking his movements through airline records would find him in Chicago or in another hub city rather than in Vermont. The rental car taken in Chicago rather than Burlington meant that the rental car record connected him to a city with no obvious relationship to the crime, not to the city near the crime scene. He drove the distance between the rental location and the crime location, working at night, arriving when the risk of witnesses was lowest, leaving when the risk was still low. The rental car itself produced no investigative lead in the context of an investigation that did not yet know who it was looking for, because rental cars leave no more specific trace than the name and credit card information of the renter, and the name and credit card information of a man from Alaska renting a car in Chicago is not, in the absence of any other connection to a Vermont crime, an investigative lead. The victim selection methodology eliminated another investigative tool. The standard approach to investigating violent crime involves understanding the victim, because understanding the victim almost always illuminates the perpetrator. The victim's relationships, their movements, the people who had access to them, the people who had motive, the people who appeared in both the victim's history and in the vicinity of the crime. All of this produces the network of connections that investigation can follow toward the perpetrator. Keyes' victims had no connection to him. Understanding them as victims provided no illumination of him as perpetrator, because the connection between them was not in any history or any relationship, but only in the specific moment of opportunity that he had created by placing himself in the vicinity of a person he had not yet selected. This is the most fundamental operational innovation in his system, the selection of victims of opportunity rather than specific targets. Most serial killers select victims according to some pattern, some characteristic of the victims that connects to the perpetrator's specific psychology, a physical type, a demographic group, a setting, or a behavioral pattern, something that reveals the perpetrator's fixation and that creates an investigable signature. Keyes had no fixation of this kind, or if he had one, he had suppressed it in the service of operational security, had substituted operational opportunity for whatever preferences his psychology might otherwise have expressed. The victims he chose were the victims who were available, in the right circumstances, at the right time, when he had positioned himself to take advantage of that availability. The murder kits solve the problem of evidence transportation. Every item used in a crime is a potential piece of evidence that can be traced to its origin if it is purchased in ways that leave records, or if it is associated with the perpetrator through any prior contact. By pre-purchasing the items in the murder kits and burying them in remote locations, far from both his home and the planned crime area, Keyes created a supply chain that was essentially invisible. The items in the kits were not purchased in Alaska where he lived, were not purchased near the crime location where they would be used, were purchased in a third location at a time that had no relationship to the specific crime they would eventually serve, and were retrieved only when they were needed, so that no record of a recent purchase in the area of the crime could connect a suspect to the crime. The bank robberies that funded his operations were themselves a model of operational discipline. He committed 11 confirmed robberies in locations distributed across multiple states, using consistent methods that minimized evidence and maximized efficiency. He used demand notes rather than verbal demands, reducing the quality of witness identification. He wore disguises. He selected branches in locations that provided good exit routes. He did not fire his weapon, which was the single most important decision he could make to minimize law enforcement response, because bank robberies where no shots are fired receive a less intense immediate response than bank robberies that turn violent, and the difference in response intensity translates into the difference in how quickly the geographic search begins and how quickly he can put distance between himself and the location. He was gone before the perimeter could be established. He had a car waiting that was not connected to him in any way that could be quickly established. He was in another jurisdiction before the investigation had assembled itself. The financing dimension of the case is one of the elements that investigators find most revealing about his sophistication, because it demonstrates that he understood the financial dimension of operational security in a way that most violent offenders do not think about at all. The expenses associated with his criminal activities were real: airline tickets, rental cars, gas, lodging, the supplies in the murder kits, the various incidental costs of traveling to commit crimes in distant places. These expenses had to be covered in a way that did not produce a financial trace, did not connect a bank account or a credit card to the pattern of travel and location that his crimes involved. Cash was the solution, and bank robbery was the method of acquiring cash in quantities that were useful without requiring the kind of accumulated legitimate income that would have taken time to gather and that would have been connected to traceable financial records. The self-imposed constraint of approximately 1 killing per year was an operational decision rather than a psychological one, or at least it was described in operational terms by the person who had imposed it on himself. He understood that frequency of crimes increases exposure to the various risk factors that could produce detection. More crimes mean more potential witnesses, more potential forensic errors, more potential for the kind of small mistake that accumulates into a detectable pattern. 1 killing per year, roughly, across a period of 15 years, is not a frequency that produces statistical salience in the crime data of the United States, is not a number of crimes that generates the specific investigative response that a series of geographically connected crimes would generate. The individual cases are investigated as individual cases, each one without connection to the others, each one drawing on the investigative resources of its specific jurisdiction without any mechanism for pooling those resources or identifying the common thread that runs through all of them. The FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, the unit that is responsible for providing investigative support in cases of this type, exists partly to serve as the mechanism for identifying precisely this kind of cross-jurisdictional connection. The center receives reports of violent crimes from law enforcement agencies across the country and analyzes them for the specific patterns that suggest connected crimes, the behavioral signatures and the forensic matches and the geographic relationships that indicate a single perpetrator operating across multiple jurisdictions. The cases did not produce these indicators because the cases did not have the behavioral signatures that the center is built to look for, did not have the geographic relationships that connect crimes to a perpetrator who lives in one place and kills in another place nearby, did not produce the forensic matches that would have allowed the cases to be linked. The center's tools were not built for the specific problem that keys represented, and this is the lesson that the FBI has tried to extract from the case: the specific understanding of how the existing architecture fails when confronted with a type of offender it was not designed to detect. The extraction of that lesson has been complicated by the reality that designing an investigative architecture capable of detecting Israel Keys-type offenders, offenders with no victim type and no geographic signature and no forensic trail and no connections to their victims, is a genuinely difficult technical and methodological challenge that the existing investigative sciences are not well equipped to address. The interrogation sessions themselves constitute a unique document in the history of American serial murder investigation, a set of recordings of a man who understood the investigative process he was engaged in and who was engaging with it on its own terms, who was treating the investigators across from him as professionals he could negotiate with, rather than as adversaries he needed to deceive or obstacles he needed to manage. He was, in some sense, more comfortable in the interrogation room than the investigators were, more familiar with the specific game being played, and more practiced at the specific moves it required. He had, in some ways, been preparing for the possibility of this conversation for years, had thought about what he would disclose and what he would withhold, and under what conditions he would offer specific information in exchange for specific things, had run through the contingency in his planning in the same way he had run through every other contingency. The investigators who sat with him recognized this and worked with it, used it as a foundation for an interrogation approach that attempted to engage with him on the terms he had set, while also maintaining the advocacy for the victims and the families that their professional role required. Special Agent Goyden has described the specific challenge of sitting with someone who is clearly intelligent and clearly capable of a kind of rational self-awareness that most violent offenders do not have, while also knowing what that person had done and maintaining the professional and moral clarity that the investigation required. The challenge is genuine, and the accounts she has given of it are honest about its difficulty, honest about the specific discomfort of an encounter that did not fit the framework the training had provided. He told the investigators that he had considered what it would mean to be caught, had thought through the scenario in advance, had decided that he would provide information selectively and in exchange for specific concessions. He described this calculation openly, which was itself an unusual feature of the encounter, the specific willingness to be transparent about his own strategic management of the situation. He was, in the interrogation room as in every other context, managing his presentation, choosing what to make visible and what to keep invisible, and he made visible the fact of that management, perhaps because making it visible was itself a form of control, a way of signaling to the investigators that they were dealing with someone who understood the game. The note he left when he died has not been fully made public. It has been described as containing verse, as being written in a deliberate and considered way that suggested it was not a spontaneous document produced in the moments before his death, but something that had been composed across time and that represented a final statement he had prepared in advance. The content of the note, to the extent it has been reported, reflected the same controlled self-presentation he had maintained throughout the post-arrest period, the same management of how he was seen and what he was understood to be. He was, in the note as in the interrogation sessions, the author of his own story, managing the ending with the same attention to the narrative he had brought to the beginning. He was found in his cell on the morning of December 2nd, 2012. He had been held in the Anchorage Correctional Complex, a state facility, because the federal detention facility in Anchorage did not exist, and the state facility was the available option. The specific conditions of his confinement, the question of how much monitoring was applied to a person of his specific risk profile, has been examined in the aftermath of his death, because the self-inflicted wounds that killed him represented a failure of the monitoring that is supposed to prevent high-value detainees from taking their own lives before the investigation they are central to has been completed. He was 34 years old. He had been in custody for 9 months. The investigation into his crimes had extracted significant information across those 9 months, had confirmed the Courier and Koenig murders, had located the remains of the couriers, had assembled the operational picture of his methods, had produced the interrogation recordings that are now part of the FBI's training materials for a specific type of case. It had not produced the full accounting that the investigation required, had not produced the names and locations of the victims whose identities remained unknown, had not produced the definitive answer to the question that defined the case. The case was formally closed after his death. The formal closure represented an institutional acknowledgement that the investigation had reached the limit of what it could accomplish, that the specific information it required could not be obtained through the investigative means available to it after Keyes was gone. It was a termination, the stopping of a process that had not reached its destination, because the destination was placed permanently beyond reach on the night of December 2nd, 2012. The families of the victims, whose names are in the public record, have lived with the specific aftermath of what happened to their loved ones. The family of Samantha Koenig, whose disappearance triggered the investigation through the specific chain of events that the ATM card initiated, has dealt with the particular dimension of having the mechanism of their daughter's abduction documented in surveillance footage that has become part of the public record of the case. The family of Bill and Lorraine Currier has dealt with the specific aftermath of a loss that was investigated for months without producing anything useful, that was resolved only through the confession of the perpetrator months after it occurred, and that was then folded into the larger story of a case that the public's attention was primarily directed at the perpetrator rather than the victims. The families whose loved ones disappeared and were never connected to Keys, whose losses are part of the total count that 11 represents without being identifiable as such, have no idea that this connection may exist. They are living with the specific open wound of an unexplained disappearance, not knowing that the explanation may have been Israel Keys, may have been a rental car in the night, and a man with no connection to their family, and a buried cache retrieved from a remote wilderness area, may have been a crime of opportunity committed by someone who flew into the nearest city and drove to where they were, and chose them because they were available to be chosen, and left no evidence because the system he operated was designed to leave nothing. That is the full weight of the Israel Keys case, not the weight of one man's crimes, though the weight of those crimes is substantial and real and is felt by the families of the people those crimes destroyed. The weight of the uncertainty, of the 11 that is a floor rather than a count, of the questions that the investigation formed and that the investigation's closure did not answer, of the cases that are filed somewhere as open missing persons cases, and that may be the cases of people Israel Keys killed and whose families will never know why they disappeared. How many people did Israel Keys kill? The investigation is closed. The question remains. The silence is permanent. And somewhere in the wilderness, the buried caches wait. The institutional memory of the FBI preserves the Keys case as one of the most significant investigative challenges in the agency's modern history, not because of the body count, which may never be definitively established, but because of what the case revealed about the specific limitations of the investigative architecture that the agency had built over decades of work on serial violent crime. The limitations are real, are structural, and are not fully addressed by any of the reforms and methodological reviews that the case prompted. They cannot be fully addressed within the existing framework, because the framework was built for a problem with characteristics that the Keys case did not share, built for a type of offender who leaves patterns and connections and evidence, built for crimes that happen within the social and geographic worlds of the people who commit them. The case is in the training curriculum. Future FBI agents and analysts learn from the Keys case what the case has to teach, which is partly about the specific methods of a specific offender, and partly about the structural blind spots that those methods exploited, and partly about how to conduct an interrogation of someone who is engaging with the process strategically rather than responding to it emotionally, and partly about how to manage the specific relationship between what the investigation needs to know and what the person who possesses that knowledge is willing to disclose, and on what terms. The training does not produce certainty that the next Israel Keys will be detected sooner. The training produces awareness that an Israel Keys type offender exists in the category of possible perpetrators that the investigative architecture must account for, and that accounting for it requires specific adaptations of method and approach that the architecture has not yet fully incorporated. The gap between the awareness and the adaptation is a gap that the next case of this type will test, and the outcome of that test will depend on things that cannot be fully predicted or controlled in advance. Bill Courier and Lorraine Courier were people who deserved to die of old age. Samantha Koenig was 18 years old and had her whole life ahead of her. The others, whoever they are, wherever they are, were people who also deserved to live, whose families also deserved the ordinary life of not knowing what it is to lose someone to an inexplicable violence, whose names belong in the record of what Israel Keyes did and are not in that record because he ensured they would not be there, because the silence around their deaths was as deliberately constructed as every other element of the system he built and operated for 15 years across the geography of a country that did not know he was moving through it. He was caught because he made a mistake. He made the mistake because he had killed more frequently than his self-imposed discipline permitted, and the increased frequency had loosened the operational control that the discipline provided. He was caught by a traffic stop in Texas, by the ordinary random encounter of a patrol officer with a vehicle that matched a description that had been circulated across multiple states. He was caught in a way that had nothing to do with the investigative machinery being adequate to the challenge he posed. He was caught by chance, shaped by the specific mistake he had made with the ATM card, and the chance operated within a very specific window. If he had used the ATM card differently, if he had driven a different route, if the traffic stop had not happened on that day in that location, the investigation might not have converged on him, and he might have returned to Alaska and continued. The families who are waiting would still be waiting. The cases would still be open. The caches would still be buried. And Israel Keyes would still be moving through the country at night, in a rental car taken in a city far from where he was going, toward a crime that had not yet been committed, toward people who had no idea that the system he had built had, that night, identified them as available. That is what was stopped on March 13, 2012. Not the investigation's solution to the case, but the chance convergence of his mistake and a patrol officer's routine stop, in a Texas town, on an ordinary night, producing an outcome that the investigative architecture could not have produced on its own. The questions that remain are the questions that the stopped thing was going to keep generating, the names and the locations and the families and the answers that would have accumulated across however many more years the system would have run before something else, some other chance or some other error, produced the stop that this stop produced. The questions that remain are, in the most specific sense, the questions that his death made permanent, that he ensured would remain questions by dying before he could be asked them in the comprehensive and sustained way that a full trial and a full accounting would have required. He was 34 years old. He had 15 years of criminal history behind him, and, in all likelihood, many more years of criminal plans ahead of him. He was methodical. He was disciplined. He was patient in the specific way that operational planning requires, capable of burying a cache and waiting years for the right circumstance to retrieve it, capable of imposing on his own compulsions the schedule that his operational security required. He was, in the specific and terrible sense that the word applies here, good at what he did, and the things he was good at, dying with him. How many people did Israel Keyes kill? 11, at minimum, possibly more. The exact number died in his cell on December 2, 2012, held behind the silence that he had maintained from the beginning, released in a form that cannot be verified or confirmed, or used to provide answers to the families who are waiting, preserved in the permanent form of everything that will not be known. The case is closed. The wilderness holds the caches, if they are still there. The silence holds the names,